She had dreams, big, unapologetic dreams. A towering presence with a fierce spirit, she was determined to carve out a place for herself in a world that too often tried to erase women like her. She lived boldly, refused to hide, and stood tall in the face of rejection. He, on the other hand, lived a life built on appearances. A pastor. A family man. A respected figure who stood at the pulpit each Sunday, preaching about truth, righteousness, and morality. But behind the sermons and scripture, he carried a secret, one that threatened to unravel everything he had worked so hard to protect. And then, one cold December morning, their worlds collided in the most brutal way imaginable. A single gunshot. A body left on the street. And a man of God who chose to walk away as if nothing had happened. How does a man who claims to stand for love and forgiveness become a killer? What happens when the fear of exposure is stronger than faith itself? And why, time and time again, do stories like hers end in bloodshed? Before we uncover the chilling details of this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to where we bring you the darkest tales of love, lies, and deadly secrets. Kelly Stough was never the kind of person to let the world define her. She was bold, determined, and full of dreams that reached far beyond the streets of Detroit. From an early age, she knew she was different, but that never stopped her from pushing forward. Born into a religious household, Kelly's life started on a path many would consider traditional. Tall, strong, and athletic, she stood at an imposing 6 feet 4 inches, her stature alone made people take notice. And in a city like Detroit, where opportunities could be scarce, that height earned her a ticket out. A football scholarship to a college in South Dakota. A chance at a future that so many young men from her neighborhood could only dream of. But Kelly wasn't like the other boys. Football wasn't her passion. The roar of the crowd, the weight of the helmet, the rigid expectations, it all felt like a role she had been forced to play. Because deep down, beneath the pads and the jersey, was someone else. Someone waiting to be seen. And the longer she tried to live a life that wasn't hers, the more she felt trapped. Then came Chicago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to pursue something that had always called to her, fashion. Encouraged by her grandmother, Patricia Hale, who told her to be the best version of herself, Kelly walked away from football and into the world of design. She enrolled at the International Academy of Design and Technology, and for the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. Chicago wasn't just where Kelly found her education, it was where she found herself. The bustling streets, the vibrant LGBTQ+ community, the freedom to express who she truly was. Here, she didn't have to hide. Here, she was finally Kelly. But coming into her own didn't mean the world would accept her. When she told her family about her transition, the reactions were mixed. Some didn't understand. Some didn't want to. But her mother, Jessica Williams, met her truth with open arms. "I was glad for her," she later said. "I was proud of her for owning who she wanted to be, for living as her true self." Not everyone was as kind. Kelly faced the same struggles that so many transgender women, especially black transgender women, knew too well. The stares. The whispers. The outright violence. But no matter how cruel the world could be, she refused to back down. "You're not going to make me feel any less than who I am," she would say. And she meant it. Back in Detroit, she became a force in the ballroom scene, strutting across the floor with confidence, showcasing both her performance skills and her fashion talent. People knew her. Respected her. Feared her, even. Because Kelly wasn't just existing, she was demanding to be seen. And she wasn't afraid to speak out. When Amber Monroe, another black transgender woman from Detroit, was murdered in 2014, Kelly was one of the voices calling for justice. She knew the reality. Trans women like her were disappearing. Being killed. And no one seemed to care. "The police are unaware of our struggle," she told The Guardian in 2015. Nobody ever asks what happened to that person to get here. She had no way of knowing that, just 3 years later, she would meet the same fate. That one December morning, she would become another name on a list that was already too long. That her own life, so full of fight, so full of dreams, would be cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. But for now, Kelly was still standing. Still fighting. Still chasing a future that she believed in. A future she never got the chance to see. Albert Weathers was a man who seemed to have it all. A steady job. A loving wife. A daughter who looked up to him. And, most of all, the respect of his community. As a pastor at Logos Church in Warren, Michigan, he preached about faith, righteousness, and the importance of living a moral life. On Sundays, he stood before his congregation, Bible in hand, delivering sermons about truth and integrity. But behind the pulpit, behind the carefully crafted image of a devoted husband and father, Albert Weathers was hiding a secret. To those in suburban Sterling Heights, he was an upstanding citizen. A man of God. A hard worker at the Great Lakes Water Authority. He played the role of a responsible, respectable man, one who had built a life that others admired. But late at night, far from the watchful eyes of his congregation, he walked the streets of Detroit's underbelly, slipping into a world that directly contradicted the life he so carefully portrayed. For years, Weathers had been engaging in secret relationships, ones that clashed with everything he preached about. He frequented neighborhoods known for sex work, places where transgender women, including Kelly Stough, worked to survive. And he wasn't just a passerby, he was a client. Those who knew Weathers in this world saw a very different side of him. He wasn't the charismatic pastor or the devoted family man. He was something else entirely. Kira Butt, another transgender woman from the neighborhood, later testified that she had encountered Weathers before. He was a client, she said. And not a particularly good one. His attitude was aggressive, kind of intimidating. Weathers carried himself with an air of entitlement, as if he believed that because he paid for something, he was owed obedience. He was controlling, impatient, and had a temper that could turn sharp at any moment. But there was something else beneath his aggression, fear. For a man like Weathers, exposure was the worst thing that could happen. His entire reputation, his marriage, his career, his standing in the church, was built on the image of a righteous man. If the truth ever came out, if people ever found out who he really was, everything he had built would come crashing down. And so, every time he entered that world, he did so with paranoia. Every interaction was a risk. Every glance over his shoulder was a reminder of what was at stake. He lived in constant fear that someone might recognize him, that someone might say the wrong thing to the wrong person, that the life he had worked so hard to maintain would be ripped away from him. That fear was what drove him. And on the morning of December 7, 2018, when Kelly Stough threatened to expose his secret, that fear became something else. It became rage. It became violence. It became the trigger that sealed her fate. Albert Weathers had spent years hiding his truth. But when that truth finally caught up to him, he didn't run. He killed. That early morning, the streets of Detroit were silent, the cold winter air settling like a heavy blanket over the city. Somewhere in the darkness, Kelly Stough and Albert Weathers met once again. What exactly was said in those final moments remains uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was not an ordinary encounter. The conversation grew tense. Maybe it started with money. Maybe it was something more. Maybe Kelly had finally grown tired of Weathers' hypocrisy, of his constant cycle of seeking her out in secret, only to retreat back into his world of lies and self-righteousness. And for a man like Weathers, that was the one thing he could never allow. Whatever was said between them, it was enough to send Weathers into a panic. The fear that had always lingered in the back of his mind, the fear of being found out, of his carefully crafted life unraveling, was suddenly real. In his eyes, Kelly wasn't just a woman standing in front of him. She was a threat. And he had to silence her. The gun came out. A single shot rang through the freezing air. The bullet struck Kelly in the head, and she collapsed onto the pavement. Blood pooled beneath her, the cold seeping into her body as she lay there, gasping for breath. But Weathers didn't stop. He didn't call for help. He didn't kneel beside her, praying for the life he had just tried to take. He didn't even hesitate. He just turned and walked away. By the time the sun began to rise, the city of Detroit was waking up to another bitter winter morning. Cars moved through the streets, people bundled up against the chill, unaware that just hours before, a woman had been left to die alone in the cold. And where was Albert Weathers? At 6 a.m., he was at work. He clocked in at the Great Lakes Water Authority like it was any other day, as if the blood on his hands could be washed away with a simple routine. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore, the weight of what he had done. So, later that morning, he made the call. A carefully crafted lie. He told police he had shot someone in self-defense, that he had been the victim of an attempted robbery. He wanted them to believe he had no choice. That he was the real victim. But the truth has a way of slipping through even the most well-rehearsed stories. The evidence didn't add up. Detectives started digging, and it didn't take long before they found the cracks in Weathers' version of events. The timeline was off. The surveillance footage painted a different picture. Phone records contradicted his claims. And then there was the most damning piece of all: Kelly Stough was unarmed. This wasn't self-defense. This was murder. And soon, the facade that Albert Weathers had spent years building, the respectable pastor, the loving husband, the devoted father, was about to crumble. The news of Kelly Stough's murder sent shockwaves through her community. For those who knew her best, the pain was unbearable. Kelly was more than just a name in a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the cold Detroit streets where her life had been stolen. She had fought to be seen, to be respected, to carve out a future for herself in a world that too often turned its back on women like her. And now, she was gone. Her mother, Jessica Williams, was heartbroken. She had always supported Kelly, always reminded her that she was loved and worthy of happiness. But now, she was left with nothing but memories and an unshakable grief. She didn't deserve this, she would later say. No one does. Kelly's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was part of a much larger, more disturbing pattern. In the United States, black transgender women faced an epidemic of violence. They were targeted, ignored, and too often, their killers walked free. Advocates had seen it happen time and time again, and they refused to let Kelly become just another statistic. Activists in Detroit rallied together, demanding answers. They held vigils, they marched, they spoke out in the streets and online. "We are tired of burying our sisters," one activist declared. "We are tired of waiting for justice that never comes." But the biggest question remained. Would Kelly's case be taken seriously? For too long, the legal system had failed transgender victims, treating their deaths as afterthoughts, their lives as less valuable. But this time, there was no denying the truth. There was no ignoring the evidence, no brushing Kelly's murder under the rug. Because the man responsible wasn't just anybody. He was a pastor. A man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about righteousness while hiding a secret life of deception and violence. And now, he had blood on his hands. On December 10, 2018, just 3 days after Kelly's murder, police made their move. Albert Weathers was arrested and charged with open murder and felony firearm possession. The weight of his secrets had finally caught up with him. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out the truth. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't self-defense. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was execution. Weathers and Kelly had known each other for years. This wasn't their first meeting, and it certainly wasn't the first time he had sought her out. He had lived a double life, one in which he preached morality to his congregation, and another in which he indulged in the very things he condemned from the pulpit. And when the walls started closing in, when the risk of exposure became too great, he made a choice. He chose to pull the trigger. He chose to end Kelly's life rather than face the truth about his own. The case against him was strong, but the fight was far from over. The question now was whether justice would truly be served, or if Weathers, like so many before him, would find a way to escape the consequences of his actions. The moment Albert Weathers' name hit the headlines, the public reaction was immediate, and divided. For some, the case was clear-cut. Kelly Stough was yet another transgender woman murdered in cold blood, her life stolen by a man who saw her as disposable. To them, this was not just a personal tragedy but a symptom of a much larger issue, one that had claimed the lives of too many black transgender women before her. But for others, the narrative wasn't so simple. Weathers' supporters, particularly those within his religious community, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crime he was accused of committing. He was a pastor, a husband, a father. He had spent years building a reputation as a man of God, someone who preached about morality and righteousness. Could he really be capable of such a thing? The media wasted no time in sensationalizing the case. Kelly's name was everywhere, but not always in the way she deserved. Some news outlets fixated on her past, on her work in survival sex, as if that somehow lessened the crime against her. Others repeated Weathers' claims of self-defense without question, planting doubt in the minds of the public. But then came the evidence. Investigators uncovered a series of voice recordings from Kelly's phone. Arguments, tense exchanges, moments where Weathers' voice could be heard, low and sharp, pressing her about their arrangement. It became clear that their relationship wasn't a one-time encounter. They had history, and it wasn't pretty. Witnesses came forward, too. Other transgender women who worked in the area knew Weathers well. Some had even had their own encounters with him. They described a man who was aggressive, secretive, and paranoid, someone who wanted what he wanted but lived in constant fear of being exposed. And then there was Kelly's mother, Jessica Williams. Through her grief, she became a fierce voice for justice. She refused to let her daughter's memory be twisted by public perception. She refused to let people reduce Kelly to just another murdered sex worker, another statistic. She made sure they knew who her daughter really was, a young woman with dreams, a woman who had fought for herself, who had loved and been loved in return. She was my baby, Jessica said. And she deserved better. The debate over Weathers' motives raged on. Was this a hate crime, driven by transphobia and the shame of his own desires? Was it a crime of passion, a heated moment that spiraled out of control? Or was it something more calculated, a desperate attempt to silence Kelly before she could reveal his double life? The courtroom would ultimately decide Weathers' fate. But outside of it, one thing was already clear: Kelly's story was not just about one murder. It was about the dangers transgender women faced every day. The risks, the violence, the silence that allowed it to continue. And no matter what happened next, the fight for justice, for Kelly, and for so many others like her, was far from over. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The trial of Albert Weathers had become more than just a legal proceeding. It was a battle over truth, over justice, over whose story would be believed. On one side, the prosecution laid out the damning facts. Forensic evidence shattered Weathers' claim of self-defense. The trajectory of the bullet, the lack of any struggle, the way Kelly was left to die on the freezing pavement, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a desperate act of survival. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was execution. Then came the witnesses. The jury listened as members of the transgender community testified about Weathers' past encounters, his pattern of seeking out trans women while simultaneously treating them with disdain. He wasn't just another man who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. He was someone who had lived a double life, someone whose biggest fear wasn't danger, but exposure. Kelly's mother, Jessica Williams, sat in the front row, her face a mask of grief and resolve. She listened as friends spoke of her daughter's dreams, her ambition, the way she had fought for herself even in a world that so often tried to erase her. Kelly had been more than the circumstances of her death. She had been a person who mattered. And then there was Weathers himself. The man who had once stood behind a pulpit, preaching about righteousness and truth, now sat in a defendant's chair, silent as the details of his secret life were laid bare. He had spent years hiding behind faith, behind family, behind the image of a devoted husband and father. But there was no hiding now. When the time came for a verdict, the room held its breath. But what should have been a moment of justice turned into something else entirely. Albert Weathers didn't stand trial for murder. Instead, in 2022, he took a plea deal, admitting to a reduced charge of involuntary manslaughter. It was a shocking turn, one that left Kelly's family and supporters reeling. A man who had pulled the trigger, who had left her bleeding on the street, would not be convicted of murder. Then came the sentencing, 8 to 15 years in prison. A decade, at most, for a life taken. The outrage was immediate. The transgender community, activists, and Kelly's loved ones saw it as yet another failure of the justice system, another reminder that black transgender women could be murdered with little consequence. How many times had this happened before? How many more times would it happen again? Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Signs were held high, voices demanded accountability, but the system had already spoken. For Kelly Stough, there would be no true justice. And for Albert Weathers? One day, he would walk free. Kelly Stough's murder is more than just another crime story, it's a painful reminder of the harsh reality faced by transgender women, especially black transgender women, every single day. She was a woman who dared to live in her truth, who refused to shrink herself in a world that often saw her as invisible. She had dreams, she had ambition, and she had a fire inside her that no amount of hatred could. But in the end, she was taken by a man who feared what she represented, his own truth. Albert Weathers wasn't just a killer. He was a man who had spent years living a lie, preaching about righteousness while secretly indulging in the very desires he condemned. And when his secret threatened to come to light, when the weight of his own double life became too much, he chose to silence Kelly in the most violent way possible. Not with words. Not with distance. But with a bullet. And yet, the justice system failed her. 8 to 15 years. That was all her life was worth in the eyes of the court. A man who took another person's life, who left her bleeding on a freezing Detroit street, will one day walk free. And when he does, he will go back to a world that still doesn't value women like Kelly, that still allows violence against transgender individuals to go unanswered, that still looks the other way. But what about Kelly? What about the countless others like her? Who speaks for them? The outrage over this case wasn't just about one life lost, it was about a system that continuously fails the most vulnerable. It was about the countless transgender women who are murdered every year, their stories buried beneath the headlines, their killers walking free, their voices silenced. So now, we ask you, do you think Albert Weathers' sentence was fair? Should he have faced a harsher punishment? And most importantly, what can we, as a society, do to better protect transgender individuals from violence and discrimination? This case is just one of many. But it doesn't have to be forgotten. If Kelly's story moved you, if you believe justice should have been served, then let's keep the conversation going. Share this video, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal. Because the truth deserves to be told.